I sometimes think of myself as an agnostic Gnostic, which is sort of like the words are literally antithetical, but I don't think it's mutually exclusive at all, because you can definitely have a experience of gnosis. You can definitely have an experience of direct confrontation with the mystery and take it totally seriously, but still be like, I don't know what it is.
Michael Phillip,
Hey,
welcome
man.
to the Maps Canada
Thank you.
podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Michael is a writer, podcast host, speaker, community builder, and wonder junkie. Driven by unquenchable curiosity, Michael has managed to cut through the digital noise to build a significant presence online. His ever-growing show, Third Eye Drops, consistently ranks in the top 10 of his iTunes category and has received over 2 million downloads. Michael has released and appeared on hundreds of podcast episodes, melding minds with a wide range of multidisciplinary experts, including scientists, artists, philosophers, spiritual teachers, best-selling authors, and viral personalities. Michael has written and spoken on topics ranging from technology to happiness for outlets like HuffPost, Medium, and Disinfo. He also holds a BA in journalism.
Thank you.
So there
And
it
thank
is.
you for reminding me that I need to get that bio updated, because it's like super old. Some of those websites don't even exist anymore. But yeah, I've been
Yeah, I haven't heard of
yeah.
Disinfo, but it
Yeah,
sounds cool.
actually, when I first started publishing stuff online, they were like this cool alternative media platform that would talk about, yeah, a lot of the stuff that's become popular in this sort of, psychedelic space, Jungian space, weird
Mm.
alternative ideas and stuff like that. It was run by this guy named, for a while when I started, it was run by this guy named Matt Staggs, who is this really cool guy. And weirdly, he's like the guy who books for Joe Rogan now. So it's like this,
Oh,
yeah,
no way.
yeah.
Okay.
So it's like a
Weird
weird,
connection.
it's a weird, small world in this realm of,
Yeah.
yeah.
But his website doesn't exist
No,
anymore?
yeah, I remember. Do you by chance remember the website Reality Sandwich?
I was just
Yeah,
gonna mention that. Yeah, I was gonna say
it
it
was
sounds like
around
that.
the same time. It was around the same time, and I
Okay.
think at various points maybe people were kind of involved with both. But yeah, they're both kind of
Mm.
gone or not in their original form anymore. Yeah.
And Reality Sandwich was by Daniel Pinchbeck, no? Who's also like wrote a bunch of books
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
in the psychedelic
I know
space in
he was
general.
involved with it. I don't remember the history as well. It's like it's one of those websites where I know people that know all of the main players involved and were a lot more deeply
Right.
involved, but I'm only like tangentially associated with that site. I think maybe I had like
Yeah.
something published on there, or somebody published something about my podcast back on the day in there, but yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it was a different time, man. It was definitely a different era. It was like social media was around, but it doesn't feel like it was quite dominating like it is now,
Right. Yeah.
where y- yeah,
Yeah. I can't remember the last time I actually went on a website like specifically just to read an article. You
yeah,
know,
yeah, it's changed a
it's kind of
lot.
more just a
Yeah, the
place.
way information has disperses now is so much different. And it's kind of scary in some ways, because I'm not I myself always try to carry ideas lightly. I'm not religiously connected immortally, really, to almost any idea. But even
Hmm.
with that disposition, I sometimes feel afraid to talk about certain topics, just to bring them up, because information is so tightly controlled now. And we spend years and years and years building these platforms, um, or channels on these platforms, rather. And the notion of having it taken away or shadow banned
Yeah.
or whatever, it really, even if it's just subconscious, it really does deter you from having open conversations sometimes.
It's a strange thing to also even just like have all your stuff out there in this kind of ethereal
Yeah.
space that is the cloud, and just think that it's totally outside your control. Yet like you're kind of just surrendering to the fact that one day potentially all that stuff could just like turn against you or go away or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's true, man. It's true. But yeah, anyway, I just sort of hijacked the conversation from you. So
No worries. But yeah, if we want to get back on topic, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show specifically is because I know you're really interested in death psychology and archetypes, and I wanted to ask you about your thoughts and how psychedelics relate to all of that. So, on the podcast, we have a lot of scientists, we have a lot of people that work in
Yeah.
policy, and I think you can bring kind of a different perspective on that. Not to say you're like uh, not with the science, like, but just like kind of like there's so many sides to this
Yeah.
diamond that is the intangible psychedelic experience. So like, what do you think are the limits, if any, of empirical science as a way to understand psychedelics, and like what's the line between making progress in that zone versus like the
Yeah.
potential danger of reducing it just to that?
Hey, we hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. Now, if you want to support and become part of the psychedelic movement, feel free to donate to MAPS Canada at the link in the description below. Thank you for helping our mission to support equitable access to legal and regulated psychedelic medicines for all Canadians.
Yeah, well, there's two ways I want to go because you had a really glimmering wonder nugget for me to go after in the beginning there, with the Jungian comparing the sort of archetypal and Jungian with the psychedelic experience. That's a whole interesting line of inquiry and conversation. But the latter question is really interesting too. I guess I'll go for that one first, which if I remember correctly, you were talking about it, like sort of is there a limit to empirical wisdom and science to tell us about the psychedelic experience? And of course,
Yeah.
the in a lot of ways, I think the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience is sort of untouchable by the empirical, in that how can you ever reduce down a subjective, moving, multifaceted somatic psychic experience? How can you ever capture that in empirical measurement, right? That doesn't mean that these molecules can't be weighed and measured and shouldn't be weighed and measured, and the neuroscience shouldn't be weighed and measured, and you know we shouldn't dive as deeply into it as possible. But the notion that
Mhm.
that's going to somehow yield explanation of what these experiences mean subjectively, I just don't think. I do think there's a line. It's funny because the idea of being a dualist is sort of now considered to be bad philosophy or something.
Yeah.
But for me, it's like there really is this internal, psychical, archetypal, visionary realm that, of course, I think the empirical and the molecule and the neuroscience all feeds into that and is related. But I do think that there is some kind of line that we don't quite understand. Like there are these borders that we don't quite understand between the subjective and the objective and the empirical.
Yeah, and like I guess Jung was kind of dancing on that line too
Oh
himself,
yeah.
being trained as a doctor and really hardcore material science, and then kind of discovering or being thrown into this world of ideas and archetypes, and kind of having to figure out if that line was like how tangible that line was between them.
Yeah. Yeah, he had his famous sort of encounter with the unconscious, which eventually yielded that book behind me, the Red Book. And
Yeah.
to me, that's really when it seems like in his personal life, like the psychic tidal wave, just overcame his ego. And I think we all, anybody, not all of us come to this point because clearly, most people walking down the street don't go deep into the visionary realm and, you know, sure they might consider and play with these big questions at various points in life, but really take them seriously, really just almost drive themselves insane trying to gain insight into the true nature of mind, the true nature of what we're doing here in this incarnation. And that's what Jung did. You may know about his sort of relationship and then schism with Freud. He was, sort of Freud's right hand man and his apprentice, and was set to take over Freud's psychological legacy. And because of the philosophical divides between him and Freud, he just wasn't comfortable doing that, to just greatly nutshell this story. And after that, his career just kind of dead ended. He personally just began this period of soul searching. He was approaching that middle age point, so he was kind of exiting, um, that part of life where things are simple and easy, and you just have, you don't consider getting old and aging. So all these things were coalescing in his life at once. And yeah, I think you're right. I think that's when all of these things came to a head and yielded just an absolute treasure trove of mystery and theory. And we're still talking about it decades and decades later. It's
Yeah.
wild, man.
And
Yeah.
it makes me think that what you mentioned that these things came about more when he was heading towards like the maybe half of his life.
Yeah.
And Jung wrote about that a lot too, like the kind of, the second half of life as a time where these things become more important. And it makes so much sense because death, this thing that we kind of try to push away most of the time out of the psychic boundaries, just comes like more and more head on.
Hmm.
And I don't think there is a sane way to think about death that is entirely, um, let's say, uninvolved and objective, because I think that just leads to a kind of nihilism. Uh, if we're confronted with our own mortality and the only answers that we find within ourselves are just like completely just what the carcass that we're going to become.
Yeah.
Uh, but, whether that's like it's true that there's another dimension to it or not, I don't think it's very healthy for us to do it just dwell in that material one.
Right. Yeah. It is such a hard question to grapple with, especially from the philosophical position that we find ourselves in as Westerners, right? Where, at least popularly, it's this binary between a Judeo Christian way of thinking, or it's the scientific materialist way of thinking. And most people latch on pretty tightly to one or the other, or they go down this middle road of just not thinking about it, because that's another thing we're really good at doing in Western culture, is just anesthetizing ourselves with novelty, entertainment, easy calories, all of these things that we have access to, which, believe me, I take advantage of. But that throbbing existential question has always troubled me from a very young age. It's troubled me, and I've, for whatever reason, I've always looked at these big cultural entities like, the things people do for a living, religion, government, and I just always was like, why do people do
Yeah.
that? Why, from a young age, I was like, I remember going to, like, I didn't grow up in a particularly religious household. Like, we would go to churches on like special occasions or something, but I just remember going into those spaces with like, why do people do this? Like, why do they like that? Why do they think that? Why are they so convinced of this? Why is it like this and not like that? And in some ways, that's like the philosophical dilemma, right? You can ask the questions and look deeper, but as anybody who's listening right now knows, you're just going to find more questions. If you start asking those questions, it's going to lead to another
Questions all the way
question.
down.
Questions all the way down, man. And I was one of those people who, in my early 20s, I was starting to think I had some things figured out. I thought a lot of these cultural entities were, just there to make people comfortable, just to make people a little more okay with the inevitability of their carcasshood.
Yeah.
And then I started becoming aware of people like Jung, becoming aware of even just kind of a lot of the mainstay Western philosophers who are asking questions about the nature of consciousness, asking questions about the nature of mind. And that really opened a lot of this stuff up for me. And then other thinkers too, like, people like Robert Anton Wilson, people like Ram
Mhm.
Dass, people like Alan Watts, other ways of approaching these big questions that weren't so cut and dry, but were very wonder facing and very mystery curious.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, I've been babbling, so
No, like, but
getting back
it
to
makes
it.
me think. Like, I think that's that personality trait in you that wanted to see beyond whatever you were introduced to as like the default reality is probably, is the trait that makes you and other people seek out psychedelic experiences because they're
Yeah.
like personal encounter with that more with the mystery, and going back and back to it to try to understand, to dig, scratch a little bit more, is, I think, like, yeah, it's weirdly like the task of certain people, it seems, or it's like, it's kind of like art. I see it, for me, as a personally, as a visual artist, it's like this itch that needs to be scratched. Like, oh, I need to express this. I need to, like, uh, make this thing material.
Yeah.
Think, yeah, like, I don't think you could possibly just numb down this thing, um, and feel okay with it, right?
Right. No, I certainly can't. Like, I believe me, I've tried. I've obviously had to work like I'm a completely normal person. I don't come from a lot of money. I've had to work normal jobs and like push these questions down and, do everything everyone else needs to do. But for me, man, that snake of wonder and curiosity just keeps like roiling around in my guts and I can't stop. And
Wow.
that's what eventually led to me, making a podcast and having my own psychedelic experiences and exploring wisdom traditions and Jung. It's just, it's not really, it's almost like not a choice in a way.
Yeah.
It's like, it's just, I don't know what I need to do, but I need to do something. And it's this weird open ended curiosity that I really cannot quell. And, I know you're really interested in Jung and wanted to talk about Jung. And I think the thing that makes him so important is he managed to somehow become this great connector who was recent enough that you can go back to the corpus of his collected works. That's just massive. It's fucking massive. And it's not the easiest to approach, but almost any idea that you're curious about in spirituality, mysticism,
Mm.
esotericism, he dove into it and he has remarkable thoughts on it that always connect right back to the human psyche. So it's always like, if you find yourself attracted to some archetype, some image, to alchemy, to whatever it is, you can go to Jung and be like, what did this massive intellect who had this same roiling call from his soul as I do, what did he think of it? And that to me is always like an amazing, at least, jumping off point. Like,
Yeah.
there are some things that maybe we've learned a lot about in the decades since he's died, but it's always a great entryway at a minimum. And usually it leads me like into such big questions and I'm like, man, these aren't even answerable questions. And
Yeah.
this guy has already done the footwork to dive into it, and now I feel like my curiosity has been sated and I can move on to the next thing or whatever it is. um so yeah, man, he's just, to me, he's an absolute jewel of the mystery, and I'm so glad he exists because I think in a lot of ways I'd be completely listless without him and
Mm.
without a few other people
Uh,
like him.
there's a feeling about his writings that are, a few others are like that, in the sense that it's very non-dogmatic and it doesn't really claim to have
Yeah.
answers. It's just like really thoughtful ways of putting the questions and
Yes.
curiosities that are brought up. Because I think after having been exposed to the mystery, whether through psychedelics or other experiences, a lot of people will go looking for answers, and sometimes get drawn into currents that are really more cultish, or kind of, even
Yeah.
if it's subtler, still claim to have kind of an objective answer. And I don't find that in Jung. It's really more just like a co-explorer with you, that's kind of like showing you things, but not wanting you to, like, necessarily even believe him.
Right, right. Yeah, there's something so unsatisfying to me about trying to capture the lightning of mystery in a bottle.
Yeah.
Like, oh, okay, God is this, it has this attributes. There, now I understand what God is, so I can somehow be more comfortable, right?
Yeah.
Um, and on that note, like, his thoughts on God are a perfect example of this. I'm not sure if you saw it, but I put a video out recently on Jung's thoughts on God.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and man, it's exactly like you're describing. It's, he said in a famous interview, I believe it was a 1959 interview, not long before he died, with the BBC. And the interviewer asked him, "Do you now believe in God?" I'm sure many people listening may have seen this interview because it's really famous. And he just has this sort of enigmatic look on his face, and he smirks and he goes, "I don't believe. I know. I know." And that led a lot of people who believed in God, the Judeo-Christian God, to be like, "Yes, Jung believes in God, this massively intellectual, um, important cultural icon believes in our God."
Yeah.
And he was so disturbed by people's reaction that he actually wrote a letter to the BBC publication The Listener saying, "That is not what I said. What I said is I don't believe I know. And what I know is that my intellect has encountered a mystery too large to call anything but God. I don't know a specific God. I don't even know if what I'm saying exists. But from my vantage point, I believe the mystery exists. And as a matter of fact, I believe the mystery is not good or evil. I
Mm.
believe it's beyond good and evil. I believe good and evil are relative concepts to the human predicament. All of these different things that were kind of heretical, but felt very true to me in
Mhm.
my own experiences with psychedelics and my own experiences with, trying to make sense of both the beauty and tragedy of existing. Uh, so yeah, that is a great example of exactly what you're talking about. I think is this more open ended
Yeah.
way of approaching the mystery, not trying to reach a particular conclusion that makes us feel better, but really trying to approach it with no hubris, being humble, and just trying to really fathom the unfathomable.
And it is really uncomfortable to dwell in that space with the kind of, as you said, the mystery that is beyond good and evil. And, I think
Yeah,
some experiences show you that there's of course, as everyone knows, like the darker potential of any kind of religious or psychedelic experience, that sometimes it is like in your face, the uncaring
yeah,
or caring, but somehow cruel nature of life. And it's really hard to resolve that, I think, through any kind of explanation. But somehow, I guess the feeling that there is a truth to it is what makes it somehow bearable. Like knowing that the darker side,
yeah,
the darker trips, or our own shadow is like somehow still worth exploring.
yeah. Right, because when you're in consensus reality, you can easily begin to convince yourself that, man, I think this is all in my head. I don't think, it probably really is just material evolving, undergoing adaptation, iteration after iteration. And then you're like, man, maybe I need to go back into the psychic cosmos and remember what it is.
Hmm.
And like you point out, man, it's like it'll show you some stuff, but it may be to me the curvature is always pretty like Campbellian hero's journey in the way, and not in the way that's like aggrandizing the ego, but in the way where the very first step after you get through that threshold is, oh, your ego wants to know. Here's what it needs to know. It's going to die. You're going to die. Everyone's going to die. And then you're like, oh, fuck. And then, then you're resurrected. Then you get to, but I am alive. But I do get to be in this beautiful world. But there is all this mystery. But there is all like, what, wait, what am I being confronted with now? What is this? What am I a part of? What is this energy? What is this pulsating, fractal field that I seem to be participating in? And so it shows you the mystery for sure, and the mystery is definitely there, but it is not about you. It's not about you as an individual. It's not about your ego. It's not about the things that you care about. It's not about the things you're aspiring to do in your life. It's about everything, and we just are participating in the field of everything.
I'm always
Yeah,
curious if that arc is less dramatic in people who dwell in that space a lot, or even like let's say in societies where that are more in touch with nature and that are kind of facing direct reality more often. You know, I wonder if it much
Hmm.
of a shock to their system when, let's say, like a psychedelic enters their bloodstream or whatever, like that face of reality shows itself, or is it just kind of, can that place become more a matter of fact, you know?
Yeah, yeah, where we just don't question it as much. I often do think about that because I've become so interested, obviously, in shamanistic cultures, in ancient Greek mystery traditions like the cult of Eleusis,
Mhm.
where it's pretty widely accepted at this point, I think, um, that they were doing some kind of, psychedelic compound at the core of the ritual. For anybody interested in this, definitely read the book The Immortality
Yes.
Key by Brian Muraresku. It's absolutely incredible. But but I think about what their set and setting would have been approaching those, right? Because they're not going to have the same bias toward scientific materialism that we have, that we're programmed with from a young age,
Mhm.
nor they're going to have their own ideas about what the gods are and what reality is. But I think you fundamentally back then had to live in more of a mystery, in more of a, there's forces we don't understand, we fully accept that. Um, and I think with that disposition, you could come out of those experiences so much more transformed long term, because the cultural weight would not pull you back down into the mundane like it does for
Yeah.
us. And I often wish I could just have a vision of the goddess, or a vision of what they would have called, um, the other world or whatever, and not question it, because you can to me at least, I always, when I come back together, I eventually start to question everything all over again.
And that's a
But I
strength
feel like back then
in a
it would
way
have been
too.
easier.
But
Hmm. Go ahead.
well, there's just that's a strength also. The you know that kind of agnosticism is also really really necessary. But I totally feel what you're saying, that to take it seriously, but not literally, something like that. I've heard recently,
Yeah.
um, which people like Jung were able to do. Doing active
Yeah.
imagination for hours, or
Hmm.
like, yeah, as I imagine, more shamanic cultures, kind of just like living those spaces. And but again, I don't know if we want to believe that there is like a role, somehow, for like a personal role for us to play, then being kind of this like person on the line, this agnostic, half skeptic, half immersed in it, is also very, very important, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny because I sometimes think of myself as an agnostic gnostic, which is sort of like the words are literally antithetical, but I don't think it's mutually exclusive at all, because you can definitely have a experience of gnosis. You can definitely have an experience of direct confrontation with the mystery and take it totally seriously, but still be like, I don't know what it is. I don't know if that's, am I just encountering the cosmos of my gray matter in a way I normally can't? Or am I perceiving something that's outside of me, in me, and outside of me? I have no, I just don't know. And I think it's funny how few people adopt that mindset. They have an experience of the mystery, and then they just must label it. They must say it's this, they must say it's that, they must say it's just material, they must say it's God. They must, why not approach
Yeah.
like Jung and be like, I've confronted it and it's there, but I don't know what it is. And I don't know if my experiences are even valid. Like, that was another thing he said in that letter is, why would I thrust any hypostases onto this experience, any core foundational attributes? Like, I don't know what this is. Like, I all I know is I've experienced it. And other than that, I
Yeah.
that's it. That's pretty much all I can say, is that it seems to exist and I've
Yeah.
experienced it. But a lot of people are not comfortable with that open-endedness, man.
And I think maybe if you really want to nail it down to a certain meaning that's more comfortable, I feel like you might even be like halting the integration of that experience, and kind of, like putting away in a box the unfolding that it would have on your life as you keep asking yourself those questions, and you're kind of like blocking the residue of the
Yeah.
experience to have a potential to like continue to impact you on your life, you know.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. And I think, another topic I know you're interested in and so many other people are interested in is God is one of the most low hanging ways your shadow will project itself out onto the world, right? Like if you think the world is a dark, meaningless, nihilistic place, what does that say about you? If you think the world is just love and light, what does that
Yeah,
say about you? There's a lot of inside out realizations about the shadow that are right there for you if you're willing to be like, oh shit, that's not what the world is, that's my perception of the world. And where is that
yeah.
coming from? That it's there's always that opportunity to do the 180 and look back at yourself, look back at your psyche.
And that kind of feeling that it's both, like it's you and it's the world, and there's a
Yeah.
constant kind of
Yeah.
feedback between them, and the distinctions are quite blurry.
Oh yeah, absolutely, man. Yeah, and that's to your point. That's where, and to the earlier point, that's where the dualism breaks down, right? Is it's like it always seems like there's an inner and outer, and then you realize that even mainstream neuroscience is telling us, from what I understand, that your brain is always building the structure of the world and the perception of the world. Like I spoke with, I'm sure you're aware of Andrew
Yeah,
Gallimore, who's become very well known for his takes on DMT. He's a neuropharmacologist, and he tells me that we're essentially, building this model of the world that we see outside. This is not how the world actually is. And other people talk about this too, and under slightly different pretenses, like Dr. Donald Hoffman. But there seems to be pretty core agreement that what we're perceiving, it's not as simple as we are perceiving the world as it is. Like we're building this evolutionary fitness convenient way of perceiving the world. So this is not what the world is. This is just how we perceive it. And then what's crazy is that you go into a visionary experience under the influence of a strong psychedelic or like DMT, and your brain suddenly can construct this new, totally alien world almost on the fly, and that's a remarkable, crazy example of what we're talking about. That things are not as simple as in there, out there. Out there is like this, in here is like this. You can completely break down those constructs under certain
yeah. And
circumstances.
it's interesting to hear you say that, like, the way you construct reality has to do with like what's more evolutionarily like fit for us to see. So like if there is
Yeah,
an evolutionary point to whatever absorbing the DMT molecule makes you see, we sure as hell don't know it yet. um,
yeah,
or
yeah.
unless you have a theory on it or have heard of one.
No, I think Gallimore probably has some really interesting takes on that. But one thing that again, because I carry ideas lightly and I'm not an actual scientist and I'm allowed to try to sacrifice sacred cows because nothing can happen to me. Um, to me, evolutionary theory seems like such a good one that it survives anything you throw at it. And I believe that it's true, but I also don't believe that it's the irreducible ground floor of truth. And there's this meme that's existed the last 100 years or so where it's like, oh, because I can reduce every phenomena in nature and my mind down to evolution, that must be its actual function.
Yeah.
Like I don't necessarily believe that everything is just an evolutionary function. There's this great Alan Watts quote to the effect of, uh, must everything be reducible to evolution, or can it just be the expression of a joyous
Mm.
cosmos?
Wow.
You know that
Beautiful.
that's not That's not the direct quote, but it's something to that effect. And when I read that,
Yeah.
I'm like, fuck yeah. Like that's what I always feel, this little disappointment when I hear everything reduced down to an evolutionary function. And that may just be my bias, that may just totally be my bias, but
No, I hear you.
um
Yeah, no, go
especially,
ahead,
yeah.
please.
I was just going to say, especially under, that definitely, you can feel that on the natch for sure, just walking around and basking in the glory and beauty and unity of nature. But in the psychedelic space, that is one of the things that really feels glowingly present, is just the unified isness of everything as a creative expression that's doing something that we don't fully understand, but it's
Yeah.
right there and it's beautiful and it's flexible yet ordered, it's geometric yet morphing, all of these different things. And yeah, that feels right to
Yes,
me. It feels
I
right to me.
agree. And I guess there's something about the intensity of that is like it's so much that it's safer to try to reduce it to something and kind of cut ourselves off a little bit from that felt relationship, uh, from trusting that felt emotional truth that there is like a joy in the cosmos, and like distrusting that and
Mhm.
being like wanting to reduce it as fast as possible to something that we have a theory for.
Yeah.
But you made me think too, like I guess you can always reduce anything to something. Like if you have a theory, you,
Oh
you
yeah.
can basically use it to reduce everything, and you can do that with a lot of a lot of theories.
Yeah.
And so yeah, using anything as your kind of like jumping off point to kind of like bring every other idea to and explain it with that is, I guess, just like a fallacy, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the double-edged sword of, really doing the work. There's people that I'm way more warm to, like a Donald Hoffman, let's say, or like a panpsychist thinker, someone who believes they take psyche seriously, they take conscious seriously, they take it like, so for anyone not familiar with this distinction, a panpsychist would believe that everything to an extent is conscious. They don't necessarily try to boil everything down to consciousness like an idealist would, but they think in material there's some, like, even in this lens cap there's some tiny 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 conscious quality. Some people call it phi or whatever. And then there's people like, Bernardo Kastrup or Dr. Donald Hoffman, who again I'm way more warm to, I love, but to them everything, the ground floor of everything is consciousness. And I totally agree with you that if you get stuck in that way of thinking, that you're closing yourself off to possibilities. And I think that while I do think that is probably closer to truth in my, again, admittedly probably biased POV, I still don't want to get stuck in that way of thinking exclusively, because I think I'm still doing a version of what made me ask the question when I was a little kid. I'm still doing the thing of, why do you believe that? What about this? What about that? There's always going to be what abouts. And I think it's responsible. Like, if anybody is interested in these questions, which I would assume you are, because we're 37 something minutes into this podcast. Um, Understand that arriving at an answer has not always been the point of philosophy or spirituality. Like, there's this great word, aporia, this Greek word aporia, which is essentially when you reach a paradox, you reach something that's too far away, too big, too impossible to solve. And that in and of itself was seen as a
Right.
victory. Like, that in and of itself was seen as, we've hit one of these now. Like, you've hit a wall of reality here. Good
Yeah.
job. Like, that used to be, like some of Plato's dialogues end in that, for instance. And when I found that word, and when I found that sort of attitude toward that word, I was like, this is my shit right here. I might have to get this word tattooed on my body, because
Yeah.
this really feels important.
Was
Yeah.
kind of, I don't remember exactly the way we phrased it earlier, but mystery is all the way down. And I felt that wall,
Yeah.
when you said a wall of something that you hit, like I've definitely felt that during psychedelic experiences, right? mind, there's this
Oh yeah.
distinct like a door comes down. It's like no more from here. Like this mystery is like locked for
Yeah.
now.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah. And some people probably think like, "Oh, that just means you're not ready for it, but you can go through the door." Like, come on. Like even if you have the experience, it's always just going to be a subjective phenomenological experience that you eventually end and you eventually come back to consensus, quote unquote consensus reality. And what do you do with it? There's always like the following question of what do you do with it? Was that real? Did I was that sometimes I think of like when I'm in my more skeptical mindset, I'm like, was all of that just like a Jenga tower of ideas off of some experience I had? And my mind is just so blown open right now that it's able to just freestyle
Mhm.
off of that
Yeah,
so quickly that suddenly I'm just really this is all stemming from this one experience. But then my mind just built up this giant tower of um,
yeah,
you know riffage that I think now I'm somewhere out in the cosmos, but really
mm,
it's just my mind doing what the mind does and like thinking so rapidly and stochastically and abnormally that I think suddenly I'm being visited by
yeah.
the trickster or
This makes
something,
me think of there's this essay by Jung called "On the Relation of Analytical Psychology to Poetry." It's a really boring title, but
Mm,
in it he's kind of criticizing Freud's idea that art is always biographical, or in the end, like the art is always just reducible to whatever is going on in an artist's psyche in his past or her past, and like you know, so basically taking this thing that we could understand as a relationship with like another whatever that is or the world and being like no that's actually just all like you said like your mind building its own tower, but Jung takes
yeah,
the view that no, in fact, like good art, I guess, is you're infected by something. Like there's a parasite in you that's taking you over,
yeah,
and there is that relationship, and it's not just you bouncing off the walls of your own head. Um, and yeah, I'm more sympathetic to that because I think it is like I don't want to live in a solipsistic universe, even if that was to be the objective truth, which we'll never know. It's still not the way I would want to live my life, you
right,
know?
yeah, yeah. And I love that Jung took that position, and I think a lot of his discomfort with carrying on Freud's legacy was because that maybe he needed to be that archetypal counterbalance to the everything is reducible to your own biography. It implies that what about the counter idea? What if everything is
Mm,
reducible to an archetype? What if everything's reducible to something outside of you that's transcendent, that is not transcendent in the way that it stands completely apart from your mind, but that your mind is fundamentally at a lower threshold of
mm,
consciousness than this thing, or it's a like orbiting this larger
yeah.
manifestation of consciousness. And it starts to get difficult to talk about archetypes because it's easy to use language that is really broad, but I'm always afraid of doing that because it starts to sound too much like I'm talking about um
Hmm.
like a Greek god or something, which I'm totally okay with actually. But when I'm trying to be more disciplined with the language I'm using, it gets harder. But I think that I mean, I think most people who actually are creative feel that way. I mean, I've talked to so many artists over the years that feel like they're taken over by something, or they feel like something's just coming through them, or they look at a piece of work they did and they're like, I don't even
Mm,
feel like I really did that. I feel like I was just being, you know,
yeah.
directed to do it or something. Um, and I think in my best moments, I don't feel like I'm always taken over by archetypes, but in my best moments where you hit a flow state and the ego goes away and you're like, where am I even operating from right now? Like, what?
Yeah.
Who the fuck thought that idea? Like, that was way more eloquent than I normally am, and stuff like that. Like, those moments do feel archetypal. Those moments do feel like the the ego's not driving the
Yeah.
psyche anymore, and there really are these other qualities or hands on the wheel, to stick with the
Yeah,
metaphor.
and I think you can use being taken over by archetypes as one kind of language, or neurotransmitters or whatever, like making it so that your ego is out of the way. And I think it's just
Yeah.
semantics at that point, like whether you choose to see it as archetypes coming into your life and taking you over, or just your brain with these different molecules doing things. Like molecules and archetypes could be just the same thing, that we have like different words that we throw at to try to understand it.
Oh man, you're getting in some really interesting territory now that it really makes me wish that my neuroscience and my like endocrinology and all this stuff was a little more on point, because I was talking to, do you know the
Yeah.
philosopher or the psychologist James Hillman? I talk about him a lot. um, for anyone listening, he's a post-Jungian psychologist, author. His most popular book is called Soul's Code, one of my favorite books. But anyway, his son, Lawrence Hillman, is also an absolute intellectual beast. And he has been studying, immersed in archetypes since he was very young. Has a great breadth of knowledge in myth and psychology, PhD in psychology, but also has been practicing astrology since he was like 15 or something. Um, and the reason I bring this up is because now I forgot what you
Like the
said. What did
connection
you say
between
before?
archetypes and, let's
Um,
say, molecules, and just like the semantics of it. Yeah.
oh, right, right, right. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I brought that up to him during a podcast. I was like, man, in a lot of ways, the brain and the nervous system is kind of like an Olympus, because there are certain neurotransmitters and certain hormones that seem very much like an
Yeah.
archetypal quality,
Yeah.
like testosterone. That's
Yeah.
Aries. That's Aries Mars energy, right? For instance, oxytocin. Maybe that's uh, Venus, or
Yeah.
you know mother archetype, and all of these things. Like, and
Yeah.
that is very intriguing to me. That's very intriguing to
Yeah.
me.
Even it makes me think of like just the relationship of the body to the mind, let's say, to put it in the most general terms possible. But like, a lot of Chinese medicine maps like certain mental states to organs or things like that. And like, we we have a tendency to really disregard that, I guess, in modern Western science. Now there's some info coming in about the gut and the impact that the gut has on our mental health, and that's more. But it's still like kind of,
Mm-hmm.
we're like, okay, we'll accept that, but everything else we're kind of like, nope. And I think, yeah, the wisdom of the body as something that has its own um, intelligence, that's maybe not verbal the same way as we are, but definitely more communicative than just like this bunch of uh, matter that it acts like a dumb
Yeah.
child. Like that's kind of the way we have to see it sometimes.
Yeah. 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 It's funny that you bring up the gut bacteria and the biome. Like that's become one of the new hot trends to reduce everything down to. It's like, oh, you think it's your brain, but it's actually your gut
Yeah,
bacteria is all fucked
yeah,
up, and
yeah,
that's what's making you sad. Like, and I don't, and again, I don't think there's not truth to that. I think there's truth to it, but I think we're also doing the thing that people always do, where we discover something with some level of truth or medicine in it, and we're like, holy
mm,
shit, this is the missing piece. Like, this is the thing that's gonna solve mental health, or this is the thing that's
yeah,
going to like make us healthy. And it's like, well, it's a piece of it,
yeah,
but it's probably not the whole thing. But yeah, there's all this stuff now that, like, oh, depression, it's actually an imbalance of your gut biome.
yeah,
Like, it went from a problem in your brain, a
yeah,
broken part of your brain, to a broken part of your
yeah.
gut. And it's like, well, I don't think it's not true, but I also don't think that's probably the
And I guess that's
entire
really how,
story.
like, we receive science as a culture, is like hanging on to it as like the new truth. Because I highly doubt that when scientists discover something, they're like, that's it, we found it. Like I feel like the general scientific disposition is probably to be like,
Yeah.
yeah, maybe there's a new thing, let's keep looking into it. But somehow, like, it gets filtered through whatever journalism and the whatever news to the general population. We're like,
Yeah.
oh, like that's now truth, you know?
Yeah. 100%. Yeah, I think scientists get an undeservedly bad rap a lot of the time as trying to peddle answers or peddle conclusions. It's popular to beat up on scientists now for like defending the status quo of a certain idea, but I think most of it is actually
Hmm.
happening in the media, like you point out, or popular scientists who go do interviews with the express point of trying to be reductionist materialists, um, and I don't think that that accurately represents the whole like field of science. It's like saying the government, right? Like every conspiracy theorist loves to talk about the government, and it's like the government is not one thing. Like Congress, like great example right now, what's going on with UFOs. Congress is the government. The military industrial complex is the government mostly, and Congress doesn't seem to know
Mm.
what the military industrial complex is doing. So it's like a great example of how this
Yeah,
idea of the government, quote unquote, doesn't
yeah,
exist, and neither does science.
for sure.
It's like a, yeah,
I want to, just because you name dropped the trickster earlier, and that was one of my questions. I'd love to spend a bit of time talking about that. Um, for me, it's definitely been like a quality that the psychedelic experience can take or hold a lot of the time. Sometimes more darkly, sometimes more lightly,
yeah,
or I guess always lightly, but that lightness can have a bit of a dark, mischievous quality, you know? And yeah,
right,
it was just,
right,
I'd love to hear more of your musings on that, because I've definitely like felt exposed to that archetype a lot through psychedelics, and I think there's such a connection.
yeah. It's such a deep question, man. That this topic, in and of itself, is in a lot of ways, I think this is where human knowledge, this is where you hit that wall that we were talking about. This is where you hit the wall of what the human mind is capable of understanding, because the trickster archetype in and of itself is such a fun house of everything. Like within that archetype, you have a microcosm of everything. And here's what I mean by that. In Psychology and Alchemy, Jung has this absolutely brain melting quote about Hermes Mercury, because he's exploring, to contextualize it a little bit, he's exploring the concept of alchemy and how it actually maps over the human psyche, like the transformation of the human psyche on the individuation quest, going from what they would say in alchemical terms is prima materia to the the lapis philosophorum, or the philosopher's stone. And he noticed that there's always like this Mercury Hermes archetype is either directly in the art as the god, or it's like the astrological symbol plus the actual material of Mercury, which of course is very trickstery, and that it seems to be kind of both liquidy and solid. And he has this crazy quote about all of the different qualities that the Hermes Mercury archetype can embody. And it's essentially almost everything in one archetype. Like he talks about the fact that it can present itself as a multiplicity, but it's really like a multi-faced being. He talks about it as the devil. He talks about it as a redeeming psychopomp, as the wise old man. He talks about it as everything, and he also equates it to the entire collective unconscious and the individuation process. So within this one archetype, you essentially get the entire hall of mirrors and the entire transformation process of what it's possible for the human psyche to even experience. And one of the things I think is really interesting about that is the Greeks always used to say that Hermes was the most friendly god to man. And the popular way of understanding that is he's the one who always seems to be interacting. Like he's the one who will come to you in a dream. He was the one who would come and like warn Odysseus about things in the Odyssey. And I think that's true, but I also think that it's means that he's the one, or it is the archetype that really is the sort of, it's sort of the pathway that humans have to the divine, because he's not only, you know, the all of these things I described, he's like the connector, right? He's the one who he holds the caduceus, which is the symbol of the divine knowledge. He brings it from the godly realm, from Olympus or the underworld, to the realm of humans. So you have this archetypal character who is holds all this divine wisdom, transports all this divine wisdom, but is also sort of the only one who
Mm.
regularly comes and interacts with humanity. So it's like this weird. I mean, that right there, I think is probably enough. Like I could probably
Yeah.
stop there, but there's more. I mean, there's
It's
more. You know.
yeah, that's really beautiful. It makes me, I don't know why I'd never made this connection before, but it makes me think of Taoism in a way too, where the thing, like reality is transformation. Like that's the ground of it. It is movement, and it is that archetype of like
Mm-hmm.
always
Mm.
evolving and moving and ungraspable, which I, from my understanding, limited is what Taoism kind of hints at. So yeah, like the fact that tricksteriness is perhaps makes up the ground of reality, as paradoxical as that sounds, rings pretty true.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, yeah, for sure. And I mean, think about some of the most famous principles in Buddhism. You know, everything
Yeah,
is impermanent. Like that's another way of saying the same thing. And it's another way of saying what we were talking about before, is like this
yeah,
idea of trying to capture the mystery in a bottle, right? Like it's you can't do it because it's always morphing. It's the Heraclitus panther ray, you know, everything is in flux, everything is changing. You can't step in the same river twice. Also again ties into another famous um
yeah,
Heraclitus fragment. Nature loves to hide. You know, like the true nature of what nature is always elusive. You know, it's always evading. Oh, you try to measure it, you think you understand it now. You don't. You don't understand it. You understand maybe a little bit of it, but there's always another mystery. There's always another question. So yeah, it's vexing in one way, but it's also a
yeah.
major truth. It's a major, major truth.
Man, well, I can't help myself but saying that I feel like we've captured some mysteries in this bottle that were gonna send out and then they're gonna evaporate. But
I hope so.
for the time being, it felt like we touched on a lot of really interesting things, and yeah, it feels like a good point
Yeah,
to kind of end it as we circle back to a lot of the things we've been talking about, and yeah,
sure.
to the ultimate futility
Yeah,
of trying to put a definite answer on it.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Enjoy the futility, my friends, because it can actually be fun. You know, I think this is like the more uh, mysterious, wonder facing way of embracing that existentialist idea that everything is absurd, or at least the, you know, the sort of myth of Sisyphus style of existentialism. Instead of everything is absurd, you can also reduce it down to like what we just
yeah,
did. Everything's a mystery. Like everything's an open ended mystery.